Hello, good morning everybody, and welcome back once again to Teams Fest. This next session in track 2 on security and compliance is hands-on data loss prevention and retention, and will be delivered to you today by myself, Peter Rising. So without any further ado, we shall get going. Same principle applies to all our sessions today. Please feel free to ask any questions for me in the Q&A, and we will go over those at the end of the session. But without any further ado, let's get started. So, a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit about me. My name is Peter Rising. I'm a senior technical consultant in the public cloud team working for Softcat PLC. Here's how you can reach me on the various social media platforms. I'm on Twitter at M365Rising. I'm on LinkedIn as Peter Rising. You can find me quite often giving a bit of help and advice to our wonderful community members in the Microsoft Tech community. There's a link there to my profile. And I also have some various Microsoft certifications and have authored a book recently on Microsoft 365 Security Administration, the MS500 exam guide. I am also a Microsoft MVP in Office Apps and Services. So, we're going to talk about two subjects in this presentation, data loss prevention, otherwise known as DLP, and retention. We'll start with DLP first. So what is DLP, or data loss prevention? But basically, it's a set of tools and processes to ensure that sensitive data is not lost or misused or accessed by any unauthorized parties outside of your organization. And how does data loss prevention work in the overall context of Microsoft 365? It's important to have that understanding of it from the wider perspective of not just Teams, but from Microsoft 365 as a whole. We'll focus a little more on Teams itself as we go through this deck. But DLP allows you to configure policies which identify sensitive information across Microsoft 365 locations using built-in sensitive information types, and we will go through these as well as we go through the slides. The locations that DLP can check include in Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive, and Teams. And DLP helps to prevent the accidental sharing of sensitive information, such as credit card numbers or private medical information. Not the sort of stuff that you want to be passing around the internet or around the world, for sure. DLP is also a very powerful tool which can help to educate your users on the principles of accidentally sharing sensitive information by using policy tips, which are very, very handy visual prompts, which will challenge users within their Microsoft 365 applications, such as Word and Excel and PowerPoint and Outlook, of course. A very visual bar which will pop up and say, do you want to share this content? You can block it. You can allow the user to provide a justification for why they want to share it. But these help educate the users and hopefully will not restrict their ability to work as well. With DLP, there's a lot of rich information that you can get in the form of reports and alerts whenever any M365 content within your organization contains a policy match. So when that happens within the security and compliance centers within Microsoft 365, which we will take a look at, and the compliance center, you can drill down and have a look at a lot of alerting, get a lot of reports, auditing, and see what's going on in your organization in relation to data loss prevention. And DLP policies are made up of conditions. They're made up of conditions and actions, and the condition is essentially what you are looking for, and the actions are what happens when those conditions are met. So that's a bit about data loss prevention in M365, a quick sort of bullet point. introduction. So we talked a little bit in the last slide about sensitive information types. Now these are crucial in the context of data loss prevention within the Security and Compliance Center, which you can see a screenshot of here. You can also access this from the Compliance Center. I'll explain a little bit about the differences between those two centers in a moment. Microsoft do like to give us lots of portals to get to the same content on occasions. But a sensitive information type is, well, there are a number of built-in types which can be found in the Security and Compliance Center. And these are things like personally identifiable information, anything like financial information, regulatory information, all sorts of things like that. And these are broken down into regions and countries, and you can go in and configure your DLP policies to reference these sensitive information types. There are so many baked in to Microsoft 365. If for whatever reason there is an internal policy in your organization or a regulatory compliance standard, an industry standard that your organization has to adhere to that is not covered with one of the numerous sensitive information types that are baked in to Microsoft 365, you can also, as the screenshot shows here, create your own as well. You can create those based on regular expressions and dictionary large keywords and all sorts of good stuff like that. So these are really important to know about when defining your DLP policies. And I've actually talked a bit more about that before transitioning onto the next slide. So let's just do a little recap. So built-in sensitive information types, as I've just alluded to, include regulatory compliance principles relating to financial, medical, and health, privacy information from a number of countries around the world. And we see here another screenshot here of when you're setting up a DLP policy in Microsoft 365, the choices that you get for referencing those sensitive information types. So we can see on the screenshot here, I'm highlighting financial. And then you'll see that we can get broken down into different countries. We've got Australia, Canada, France, all over the world. And then we can choose medical and health, privacy, and then define some of our DLP policies as well, which will reference a mix and match of these. So yeah, and as I mentioned there, it's possible to define custom sensitive, and these may be created as keywords, regular expressions, or dictionary large keywords. I jumped the gun with that last slide and talked about it before transitioning. So that is data loss prevention in the wider context of Microsoft 365. But this is Teams Fest, and we want to talk about Teams. So how do we use data loss prevention in relation to Teams? And there are two key things that DLP does in relation to Teams. So DLP will protect sensitive information in Teams chat or channel messages, including private channel messages. It's important to point out that in order to consume this, an E5 license is going to be required. And in the example that we can show you on the screen here, we can see a DLP policy in action where it was set to detect credit card numbers. And time allowing, we will get into a quick demo of this within my demo tenant environment, and we can have a quick look at how creating policies looks and the sort of things you can do. But we can see here in this example rule that we have a rule here with condition detect content that is shared only with people inside the organization. Sensitive info for types that we are looking for in this example are credit card numbers, the actions that we want to take when there is a policy match, when somebody in Word or Excel or Outlook puts in a credit card and triggers that policy. This is what we want to happen in the actions. We want to restrict access to the content. We want to notify users with email and policy tips and send incident reports to the administrator. And here we have on the right an example of one of those alerts that get sent to the administrator when there is a policy match. And we can see that a match of one or more of your organization's policies has been detected. The service is Microsoft Teams and contains sensitive information. A low volume of content here, has been detected, and we'll show you the difference between low volume in a short while. And we can see here the rule actions are to block access, notify the user, and generate an incident report. And we can see the context there is the credit card number, which is highlighted there in bold. Now, the action that happens from an end user point of view, which hopefully you can just about see it at the bottom of the screen. It may have been a good idea for me to have changed my screenshot to light mode in Teams, but at the bottom I have my test user, James Smith, who hopefully you can see this message was blocked. So what that was, I put that credit card number in and hit enter, and the policy is triggered. It's going to block the content with that nice little red visual prompt there, and they can go no further with that, which is great. So how does this look in terms of the actual security and compliance center within the policy? So DLP protects sensitive information within documents stored in Teams, as well as within the chat messages, and this is what this slide is alluding to. But what we need to ensure that we do for that, we have to be very careful that we're including in our DLP policies all of the required locations that we will need to ensure that those policies are going to work and do everything we need them to do. So we can see in this location editing for the DLP policies that we are using here, that we have Teams chat and channel messages selected, but obviously, in terms of documents stored in Teams, well, they are going to be stored in the back end on SharePoint, in SharePoint sites. So it's important that we include SharePoint sites in our DLP policies. Excuse me, as we can see here. So that is a key gotcha to look out for. So now that's a brief sort of look at DLP. So we're going to move into a quick demo. So what I will quickly do is I will stop presenting that, and I will set up another another sharing of share my whole screen in this instance. And just bear with me a second, the perils of live demoing. So that is now, here we go. Right, let's try that again. Sharing. That is looking better, fantastic. So, bit of a practical demo here. We'll drive around some of the compliance center, look and feel of this, and the security and compliance center. And before we go any further, I did promise that I would explain the differences between these two environments within Microsoft 365. So, over the past few years, typically for anything along these lines, DLP, anything security and compliance related, well, as the name suggests, you would go to the Security and Compliance Center. And I'm going to be completely honest with you, this is still where I go. This is out of habit. This is where I go to for all things security and compliance. But more recent, and the URL for that is protection.office.com. And it takes you to this nice portal here where you have everything you can imagine relating to security and compliance. You've got DLP, you've got classification for sensitively labeling, information governance stuff, which we'll touch on when we talk about retention shortly. But this is combined security and compliance. More recently, Microsoft have been putting more and more content into the very separate security and compliance as a separate thing. So they are more and more sort of driving us towards these separate centers for security and compliance. And this is the Compliance Center, which you can reach at compliance.microsoft.com. And more and more we're being encouraged to use this for these sort of features, for things like DLP, for things like cloud app security and retention, and so on and so forth. You can see here, if I click on policies, I can click on data loss prevention. So what we have in here, and just going off on a very brief tangent, is you can see in preview now we're getting endpoint DLP settings coming into preview now, which is very exciting. Not something I've had any real chance to play with or test drive yet, but I'm very interested to have a play with that and see where it goes. But that's by the by. But I'm going to do for a quick sort of drive through on DLP from the Security and Compliance Center, because that's where I'm most familiar with, and rightly or wrongly, I'm still gravitating towards that as my go-to portal. So data loss prevention has a section here, and we can set up policies. Before we drill into that, let's just expand classification. And this is where you can see the sensitive information types that I mentioned in the slide deck as we ran through that. So if we click onto that, we can see all of these wonderful sensitive information types that are baked into Microsoft 365, and there is a plethora of these, as you can see, based on country and standard, shall we say, if we scroll through there. So chances are you're going to be able to find one that matches your requirement, but it's important to know if you can't use one of those baked-in ones, that you can create your own as well. And what that looks like, if we go to the Create button here at the top, is we can set up one for a custom. This is where I get very unimaginative, and I'll probably just call it test. And description, important, you've got to put a description in it. It is one of the required fields. So we'll just put test description in there. And then we can see here that you must add a matching element, which is the sensitive info that this type will look for in any content. And this is to increase the accuracy of detection. You can optionally, as it says here at the top, add multiple supporting elements. When that matching element is detected, at least one supporting element you add must be found within your specified proximity of that matching element for this type to be matched. So here, what we can see is for a matching element, we have the choice to detect content containing, as we alluded to earlier, any of these. We've got keywords, we've got regular expressions, we've got dictionary large keywords. Adding a keyword, very simple indeed. We can add in a keyword. Again, very unimaginative of me. Should have prepared something a bit more relevant, but if I put in the word teams, for example, we can add supporting elements as well. We can add further supporting elements which contain this regular expression, contain this keyword list, or this dictionary large keyword. We can set confidence levels here. So confidence levels, if we expand on that, these define the match confidence of the pattern. So when you use this sensitive information type within a DLP policy, you can use more restrictive actions, such as blocking the content with only the higher confidence matches, and you can use less restrictive actions as well, excuse me, such as just sending a notification instead of being more aggressive. The character proximity, if we highlight that what this is going to do is when the first pattern element is matched, any supporting elements will match only when found inside this proximity to the first pattern element. And we've got some default settings here for these. So very simple and quick to set these up. Obviously give a lot more thought to what you want to configure them as than I have in this very crude example, but this is how you do it. You can review and finalize your custom sensitive information type and then finish them, and then they will be available in the list for you to select from your policies. If the portal gods are kind to me today and do this quickly. Successfully saved, there we go. And it's recommended to test the sensitive type before you use it. So do you want to test the create a sensitive type? We'll not go too much in the weeds of that because we're getting off track. So basically I have very crudely created one here, and not the greatest example, but that is how you do it. So that's sensitive information types. And back to DLP. If we go into DLP and policies, what we can see here is just getting my other screen up just to make sure I'm not going off track. Okay, so sensitive information types, we're on to creating a policy now. So what you see in the main data loss prevention screen is you get a nice little dashboard here at the top, which will give you some nice graphs here showing you any DLP policy matches that have occurred within your environment recently, and any false positives as well. As you go, you will your environment will train itself and get to know. Users will report false positives, and it will build up that as you go. What you also see here is one of these very visual prompts here at the top that Microsoft are sort of leaning us towards using the Compliance Center as a solution to take advantage of richer capabilities. And very soon you'll be redirected there automatically. So you can do the same sort of things from there, but I'm working from here for now, rightly or wrongly. So in this example tenant here, we don't really have any matches, any false positives, because this is a demo environment that I set up a week or so ago, ready for this event. So it's not live, it's not in production. It's one of the lovely Contoso Electronics tenants, but it does have a couple of example policies in there. We have one for US financial data, which is switched on, and we have one for general data. Regulatory, so the GDPR. We can take a quick look at one of these and see exactly what these policies are doing. So if we click onto there, we get a little brief description of what it's doing. We can see that it's on. We can see a description if it has one. It doesn't. We can see what locations this policy is protecting within Microsoft 365. In this example, it's Exchange email, SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, and Teams chat and channel messages. So you can select all of these services alongside each other in the same policy. And then the policy settings, we are detecting high volumes and low volumes of sensitive content. So let's go into the policy and see exactly a bit more what that means. So this is GDPR, General Data Protection Regulations, which is a European standard that needs to be adhered to and is very, very particular. There's no description in this one, but we can see that this policy is fully in use. It's turned on, which means it's in production. It's affecting groups and locations within Microsoft 365 that it is applying to. So in full use, in full production. But you do have some other options for testing out your DLP policies when you create them. You have the option to test them out first. And what that will do is it will generate auditing results and generate alerting, email alerting. We can show you what that looks like in a moment. So administrators, compliance administrators in Microsoft 365 can go in and see exactly what would happen if these policies were being matched live. Then the next thing you can do in the test mode, if you were to select that, is you can include policy tips whilst in test mode. Typically would recommend not doing that immediately. What I would recommend, and I have a slide for this at the end with best practices, is do this first. Test it out first. No policy tips. Just test it out purely from an administrator's point of view to get a feel for what is going to be matched from your policy. Then when you're ready to sort of get the users a bit more involved and train them and educate them and get them used to policy tips and what they look like, switch on the policy tips. And then once you're happy with what that policy is doing, you can turn it right on. So that is a little bit about that. So The locations, what it's protecting, you can be very, very specific what you want to protect here. So you can protect these services here: Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Teams, chat, and channel messages, which is what we're most interested in here. So we could toggle these other services off if we wanted to. We can be very specific what we want to protect. From a Teams point of view, for example, let's focus obviously on Teams, chat, and channel messages. We can go in and we can choose to include specific accounts for this if we wanted to, that would be targeted by this policy. So we could go in here and select Pradeep, for example, to be targeted by this policy, and then we can see the change there. We have one account now that will be protected by this policy. By the same token, if there are options, that's grayed out now because of the selection we made for including, but we can exclude accounts as well from this policy. And then the policy settings. This is where we'll see the rules, which are made up of the conditions and actions that we described earlier, that define these requirements. So you can edit existing rules here or create new ones. But by default, when you create them, DLP policies have a high volume of content found and a low volume of content found. So fairly self-explanatory, a low volume of content. If we go on and edit what that rule is going to do, it's going to detect content shared inside the organization, these types of information. If we edit the rule, we can see that these is what we're talking about when we're talking about low volume of content and high volume. So this is low volume instances between 1 and 9 within the content. And as we scroll down this advanced view of the policy, we can see what it's going to do only with people shared inside my organization. You can go ahead and add further granular conditions here if you want to: sender IP addresses, email attachments, all sorts of stuff you can add in. You can add exceptions here as well if you want to. And then down at the actions, what's going to happen when these conditions are met? You have a lot of choices here as well. You can block people from sharing the content. You can block everyone, block only people outside your organization, only people who are given access to the content through the anyone with the link option, or you can apply encryption to email messages if it's Exchange, for example. And then you can go ahead and add further actions as well, like removing headers or setting headers. User notifications, very powerful, very important to get these configured correctly. Setting user notifications to on here on your policies, low volume or high volume, will notify the user who sent, shared, or last modified that content. Additionally, you can change that to notify specific people here, the person who sent, shared, or modified the content, owner of the site or OneDrive account, or OneDrive content. And SharePoint site here, that would relate to Teams, obviously, in the context of Teams documents. You have some options here to customize the experience for the email text that will be received when an alert is generated. You can customize that. Otherwise, the default will be set. The same with the policy tip. So when a policy tip occurs, you can control that as well. Then we have some settings for overrides. We can let people see who see the tip override the policy and share their content. Ignore the tip, so to speak, if you like. If we set that to 1, if we move that slider to 1, we can require a business justification to override it, override the rule automatically, and set it as a false positive. And then we've got some incident reports here as well. We can use severity levels for admin reports and alerts, and add or remove people to get that information. And very, very powerful stuff. So we'll come back out of that because I'm just becoming very conscious of time and the fact that we've not started talking about retention yet. But that is a policy within DLP. Very, very easy to set up. If you wanted to create a new one, very, very, very briefly here before we move on, we can see as the screenshot showed before. This is where you would go in and do that. Select medical and health in this instance. Select by country. We'll pick on Germany. We can see Germany financial data is there as an example. We can select that against our policy. Go ahead, give that a name and description if we want to. Choose the locations. By default, it will just go for everything, or you can get more specific. And then we can go ahead and make our selections. Teams chat and channel messages, obviously SharePoint sites will be relevant as well. And then show what it's going to do. Use advanced settings. If we select that, it'll get us into those advanced settings that we saw before. Review your settings for notifications, amount of sensitive information being shared. And then finally, before you create the policy, decide what it's going to do from the get-go. So this is what I'd do. I'd like to test it out first without policy tips, and then we can move on from there. So where are we at? Half past the hour. We've got plenty of time still. Before we wrap up DLP, what we will do is have a very quick look at alerts. And if we view alerts in here, we can, well, we're probably not going to see anything in this being a, oh, actually we are. We've got some example content in here. If you had any DLP alerts in here, you could filter by that content. So you can filter that by drill down and category it is. Sorry, not policy. There we go. Filter by data loss prevention. And let's see what that brings back. Yeah, and we've got an example in our tenant here. So this is a typical example of a medium severity. So what happened here was a file policy, a file containing PCI was detected in the cloud built-in DLP engine. And this one is actually, although it's a DLP related one, this has been detected by Cloud App Security, which is also a very powerful tool within Microsoft 365. E5 really is what you need to make the most of Cloud App Security to alert and apply governance actions across your SaaS applications and Microsoft 365. So that's an example of the alerting. You can also go to search, and in the audit log search, we can do a search for activities here that relate to not specifically data loss, but things like user sharing and that sort of thing. So important to have an awareness of the audit log, and you can see all sorts of file activities and folder activities, SharePoint list activities, Teams activities, and based on all of that, you can create alerting policies, new alerting policies from the audit log here, which will then start triggering in your alerting. So that is a good sort of segue to move on to retention, with the second part of our talk. We will quickly switch gears. So what I will do is I will go back to my slide deck, and we will bring that back up. And resume the slide. You know, wrong one. The perils of being moderator and speaker. So let me share my screen. PowerPoint from current slide, and there we go, back in the slide deck. Okay, one last note on data loss prevention, just a recap of what I've already alluded to then really is start in test mode without policy tips. This enables you to monitor alerts and logs to check if policy is behaving as expected and make any required adjustments. Then move to test mode and notifications and policy tips. This teaches your users how to use and understand the policy tips, gets them used to the principles of data loss prevention in Microsoft 365. And then finally, when you're happy, enforce the policies, turn them on. DLP policies are now live, and everyone should be comfortable with what they do and how they work. So that's DLP, and don't worry if you have a question. I can see some questions have come in, and we'll address everything at the end of the session. But before we do, we'll move on to retention. And what is retention? So, excuse me, retention is an information governance principle that allows Microsoft 365 compliance administrators to ensure that data which is subject to any internal policies or industry regulations is protected and retained for the required timescales, even if that user deletes this content. So how does retention work again in that overall context of Microsoft 365? So we have two key principles within information governance retention in M365. We have retention policies, which are commonly used to protect content at the site or mailbox level. And then we have retention labels, which are commonly used to protect at the item level, such as folders, documents, and emails. So it's important to have an understanding of that distinction. It actually took me a long time to get in my head what that distinction was. When I first started learning about retention labels, why? So sometimes it takes a while to get to grips with the principles. So retention policies may be set to either retain content or delete content. And an important principle of retention is that retention always wins over deletion if there is a conflict between policies. So we have a little example screenshot here again from the Security and Compliance Center of a retention policy as it's being created. And this is the choices that you are presented with when setting up the policy. Do you want to retain content? In this example, yes, I want to retain it. For how long? 7 years seems to be a sweet spot for various industry standards that crops up a lot. So you can retain the content based on when it was created or when it was modified. And then when it reaches its retention, the end of its retention period, you've got some choices about what you want the policy to do at the end of that time. Do you want the content to be deleted after that time? Yes or no? At the end of that period, you can say no, just delete content that's older than so many years or period of time. And there's some more advanced retention settings that you can set as well. So within the contents, the overall context of Microsoft 365, this is what it can protect. Information governance retention policies can be applied to the following locations in a single or separate policy. So we've got Exchange email, SharePoint sites, OneDrive accounts, M365 groups, Skype for Business, Exchange public folders. Teams may also be protected. Don't worry if you're thinking, where's Teams on this? I've deliberately left that. It's beneath Exchange public folders, but I've deliberately left that off for a reason. And that's because they must be configured in their own dedicated policies. So why should I use Microsoft 365 retention? And the main reasons I would say are to comply with industry regulations and internal policies that your organization is bound by. Also to reduce risk in the event of any litigation or a security breach. An example of that is it's just as important to delete content as it is to retain content. It's important to ensure that content that is stale or expired is appropriately deleted, and that if you are audited, that you can show that has been done. And finally, to ensure that users are working only on content that is current and relevant, kind of the same thing really, but put in different terms. So how do we use retention within Teams? And this is a bit further down that same screenshot that we previously showed you, where you can protect, you can retain chat and channel messages. So chats within Microsoft Teams are stored in a hidden folder of the mailbox for each user in the chat, the Exchange online mailbox. And then channel messages are stored in a hidden folder in the group mailbox for the team. So that's an important awareness piece. And as I alluded to previously, Teams retention policies must be configured separately to retention policies for other M365 locations. You have no choice in that, in fact, and if we get the chance to go into a quick demo of it before we have to wrap up, we will see what happens when you select Teams and channel messages and Teams chats in a policy which already has other locations. It will automatically switch off those other locations. And that leads us nicely into a demo again, so we can have a quick little test drive around the retention within Microsoft 365 and the Security and Compliance Center. So I will switch screens again and let's reshare. Sharing back to my demo tenant, which hopefully you can all see once again. And we've left off in DLP, but now we want to take a look at retention. And Retention, again, can be accessed from the Security and Compliance Center, same principles, protection.office.com, or the Compliance Center at compliance.microsoft.com. Important to have the right role to access this. Obviously, Compliance Administrator or Security Administrator will get you there as well in certain situations. Global Admin, obviously. Be very careful how you assign Global Admin, of course. But again, I'll work from the Security and Compliance Center for this example, and retention is contained under in the information governance section, at least in the context of policies. If you want to set retention labels, that is underneath classification. It's actually more well ordered in the Compliance Center. They've grouped things together a bit more logically, but as I'm more comfortable still in the Security and Compliance Center, I'm sort of selfishly working from this. I encourage you to go and take a look in the different compliance centers and see the different look and feel of how this all works. But here we go, retention. There we go in big yellow there. They're trying to tell me you've got to start getting used to this Compliance Center, Peter. I'm going to have to do that. but from here, here is where we've got some example policies here, and we can see typical examples here of some ones that have been set up in this demo environment for us. We've got some PII retention policies. Let's go in and take a look and see what that is doing quickly. So this is applied to any content that contains US individual taxpayer information. It's applied to these locations here: Exchange, OneDrive, SharePoint, Office 365 groups, and it's going to detect content that contains that sensitive info and keep it for a period of 7 years. Just we'll come out of that. We'll not get too bogged down in that. Let's create a new one and see what it looks like with Teams. So we'll go ahead and we'll put in a Teams retention policy. We'll not put a description in because we're not forced to. We really should though. Do you want to retain the content? And this is where we get some choices that we briefly showed in the screenshot. We can forever, for this long. We can toggle that between days and months as needed. We can retain the content based on when it was created or when it was last modified. Do you want us to delete this content after this time? Be very careful with that one, I would say. Be very, very sure that's what you want to do, because that will just happen. Or no, just delete content that's older than so many years and delete the content. Again, you have the choice between when it was created or modified. There's more options here that you can choose from. You can detect content that contains specific words or phrases, or detect content that contains sensitive info, which if we click on next, we can reference that nice sensitive info that's baked into Microsoft 365 again that we talked about within DLP policies. So that's really cool. Well, I'll go back and I'll just go back to the basic just for the purposes of this. Locations. This is where we can show you what happens. We've got these locations, all the common locations: Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive. These are all selected here. I decide I want to add in Teams and channel messages as well to this policy. I think that'd be a great idea. I'll do Teams chats as well. The effect of that, everything else is now slid to off because, as I mentioned, Teams needs its own policy. So just be aware of that when creating your retention policies for Microsoft Teams. Another important factor when you're creating these, it will take up to 1 day to apply the retention policies to the locations that you choose. So you get a little review of your settings here, the name, description, where it's going to apply to, the retention period. And important to mention as well that, again, you can choose the teams, you can exclude teams, choose specific users, exclude specific users that you want in your policy. So then we can go ahead and create the policy, or we can just go ahead and save it for later. And then the policy will be created, and job is a good one, as we say. And there it is, our Teams retention policy. And just turn that from there. And all is good. So, very conscious of time, I need to wrap things up. So I will stop presenting and let's move on to some questions and answers. So let's take a look at what we have got. Just have a look at the Can you exclude certain people from these DLP policies? That's a question from Ewood. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly there, Ewood. So let's just address what that looks like. Probably easier to show you. Potentially, I've already answered the question, but yes, essentially you can. In the policies that we have, if we create that policy, you can be very specific in terms of who is included in it and who is excluded from it. So yeah, exactly. Choose those locations, and then we have the option here to drill down, include, exclude, distribution groups, sites, teams, accounts to exclude and include. So we've got a few questions here. Are there any improvements in detecting PII in PNG and JPEGs? Last time I checked, they were not supported. That's a question from Edward Kenny. Hope I've got the name the right way around. I don't specifically have an answer to that just at the moment, but what I can do is I can take that one offline for you, and let me just bring my slide deck back up again for you. Just a moment. Hold on. Just 1 second. And what I will do, as you can see on this slide here, I mentioned earlier that I am reachable on the Microsoft Tech community. I encourage you all to check it out if you don't already know about it. It's a great area to ask questions and share ideas. If I don't know the answer immediately, I can find out, or I will know somebody who does, but I do not know everything, and I don't know immediately the answer to that question. But if you want to reach out to me, Edward, you can find me on the tech community, and I will do my best to answer that for you, or I will get an answer to you in some way, shape, or form. So then we have a question from Hans Schmidt. Is E5 or M365 E3 required, and is that in the context of DLP or retention? I'm not sure if, but just to try and give a licensing is an absolute minefield. So it's very, very difficult to keep track of that. I'm just mindful that we're quite low on time as well. But DLP, you can license that with Office 365 E3. Retention, the same comes with the. Let me qualify that. I will not compromise myself by rushing and giving the wrong answers. But does the end user need any license as well for protection to take place? Not necessarily. No, there are various different flavors of licensing that can protect using DLP and retention policies. What I can potentially dig out is there's a really good, I'll put it in the chat after we've ended this session. There's a really good licensing guidance link on docs.microsoft.com, which shows you what license is needed to consume various services. And you have to be very careful with this because there are certain services which are taken on trust, if you like. A good example of that is Office 365 ATP, where the service is activated tenant-wide, but you need a license for every user who's going to consume that. So do watch out for that. And Jacob has very kindly answered my question further down. An E5 license is required for every user that's affected by the policy. Oh, and there we go. Jacob has been so helpful to me. You've taken over moderating my session. Thank you so much. Here you can find the licensing information, platform services for security. That's exactly the document that I was going to share. So thank you so much, Jacob. That is fantastic. And DLP for correct, yes, Hans. DLP for Teams needs E5, absolutely. Absolutely. So this is where licensing gets very, very confusing. And yeah, $ I hear you, Hans. I hear you. But always changing. Keep an eye on it on the licensing. It's always changing and evolving. But so many questions. I'm sorry I've not had the chance to get to all of them. What I will try and do is I'll keep an eye on this and try and respond. I do have to move on because I'm moderating this track. But let me just wrap things up. This is going to be the end of my session because we need to get ready for the next one in 10 minutes. So thank you all so much for attending. Let's just very quickly skim through to the end because I'm supposed to show you the final slide, which is please do rate my session. I hope you found it useful and informative. And thank you so much for attending.